Everyone could take their seats. Thank you. Hi. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today. I'm Gil Capon with the American Jewish International Relations Institute, B'nai B'rith International. And we are an affiliate of B'nai B'rith International. I'd like to thank B'nai B'rith for co-hosting this event with us, and also the Israel Allies Caucus. I'm pleased that quite a few of our board members are here, including our chairman, Rick Shifter, and also Dan Mariashin, the CEO of B'nai B'rith International, and Jordana McMillan with the Israel Allies Caucus, our wonderful partners. I'm also pleased to tell everybody that we are being covered live on FedNet channel, which is available worldwide on over 200 million connected devices on Amazon's Fire TV, Haystack, Local Now, the Grio, and Relax. And it'll be available to view later on as well. I want to especially thank also Congressman Joe Wilson, chairman of the Middle East Subcommittee, for arranging for us to have this room, and his staff, Stephanie Pendarvis, Michael McHarg, and Beatrice Holding. Thanks very much for all of your help. We are here, of course, still very much in the dark shadow of the events of October 7th, the barbaric slaughter of over 1,400 innocent Israeli civilians. In Israel, they're calling it Black Saturday or Cursed Saturday. And we're very fortunate at this very difficult moment to have Einat Wilf here with us today. She came down from New York, especially to be with us. She's truly one of Israel's greatest thought leaders and spokespersons, and is the author of this extremely important book, The War of Return. And I think the subtitle is even more significant: how Western indulgence of the Palestinian dream has obstructed the path to peace. Because it's so important, more now than ever, to understand where that hatred is coming from and what it's about. We are in tragic, disturbing, and dangerous times. And as horrible as was October 7th, what makes it even more so is what we are seeing since. Just look at how quickly the narrative has changed. And look at what's going on out there on campuses, in the streets, in social media, and at the UN. It's a mixture of stupidity, ignorance, and evil, but it's very ominous. It is galling that no Arab leaders condemned the Hamas massacre unequivocally, and extremely disturbing that videos of that day show civilian Gazans participating in the invasion, looting and pillaging, and cheering and celebrating the taking of hostages and the killing. It is a sick joke that the United States and Israel are being lectured on human rights by the likes of Saudi Arabia, Russia, Cuba, and South Africa. Fortunately, some people do have moral clarity. Here, for example, is Senator Fetterman. Quote, "If not for the horrific attacks by Hamas terrorists, thousands of innocent Israelis and Palestinians would still be alive today," unquote. But even more than that, Israel pulled out of Gaza completely in 2005. Just imagine if in 2005 the Palestinian leadership or even Palestinian civil society had said, okay, the occupation is over, this is what we wanted, we are pledged to have no violence, no terrorism, we just want to build a model, peaceful and prosperous society. Obviously, Israel, the US, and the EU would have poured billions into Gaza to make that happen, and today Gaza would be Singapore. It is now crystal clear, as it should have been before, that for Israel's enemies, the problem is not 1967, not borders, not Israel's behavior, not even a Palestinian state, but 1948. The so-called Nakba occurred in 1948 with the creation of Israel, and that is their problem with Israel. In truth, if truth is a casualty of war, then it's even more important to understand and preserve the truth, and more important than ever to be clear. And those of you that are here today, it'll be important to spread the truth because the stakes are high. And now it's my great privilege to introduce one of my favorite people, someone who is really part of congressional history, a historic figure here in the Congress, someone I've known and admired and worked with for many years, ever since she was first elected to Congress from South Florida. She was the first Cuban American elected to the Congress, the first Hispanic woman elected to the Congress, and she was the first and only woman to serve as chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and was an outstanding chairwoman and a great leader on so many important issues. She was and is a solid friend of the State of Israel, and I'm very proud to say also a member of our advisory board, Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen.
I'm so short, they've got a little stepping stool here. Thank you, Gil. Thank you so much. Hey! Thank you. Gil, that's a two-way street. That's how I feel about you as well. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here today. And in addition to Joe Wilson's excellent staff, I want to point out two wonderful staffers who are here as well. And I'm sorry if there are others and I just didn't see you. Luis Reyes is a member of Congressman John James's staff. Raise your hand, Luis. John James is one of our newer folks, and he's really making quite a difference. A real veteran of the process is Gigi Reynolds from Mario Diaz-Balart's office. Mario is one of the supreme leaders of helping Israel in U.S. Congress. He is the chairman of a subcommittee of appropriations that handles state foreign ops. Very important job, and thanks to Mario, he got that bill out of his committee onto the floor, and let's see what happens now. But he's done his job and the heavy lifting. And as you know, this week a lot of great legislation will be on the floor. So we're looking forward to Iran getting sanctioned and Israel getting the help, etc. So thank you, Gil, for putting this together. Where are you? Thank you, amigo. Thank you. As all of you do, and I know that you're part of this great enterprise. But it has been said many, many times, but it bears repeating. October 7th was Israel's 9/11. It would be impossible to overestimate the level of trauma and pain that was inflicted on innocent Israelis and on the Jewish people on that day. So it's important to state it. All of the Israelis butchered and brutalized on October 7th were across the border. They were peaceful neighbors of Gaza, in Israel proper. They were not settlers. They were not in occupied territory, favorite phrases to be used. This is an important fact, and we must state it because it goes to the heart of what do the enemies of Israel want? The importance of this book, and this author, amazing, who is here with us today, Einat Wilf, is obvious. The importance of this book is obvious. Why were Israelis attacked on October 7th? All of us here would like to see peace between the Israelis and Palestinians. I've been to Israel many times. You have been to Israel many times. I think I know Israel fairly well, not as well as you, but I know the Israeli people fairly well, not as well as you, but the people of Israel very much want to live in peace with all of their neighbors. The people of Israel yearn for peace more than any people in the world. I truly believe this, and they have proven this many, many times. When President Sadat came to Jerusalem with sincerity and goodwill, he was met more than halfway by the government and the people of Israel. Israel gave up the Sinai Desert, an important strategic asset which Israel won in a war of self-defense against Egypt, in a war of aggression started by Egypt. Yet, in return for peace, Sinai was returned and Israeli settlements were removed by Menachem Begin, which was extremely painful. It was extremely difficult, but it was done, all for peace. Israel also made peace with Jordan, in spite of what has just happened today, recalling its ambassador, etc., and later with the UAE and with Bahrain and with Morocco. Every American president, also since at least Richard Nixon, has invested the prestige of the American presidency and much political capital and resources in trying to find that magic formula for peace. And yet there is no peace between Israel and the Palestinians. It is time that all of us who are concerned with the future of the Middle East and who want to see peace to ask ourselves an honest and difficult question. Why, after all of these efforts that not even Hercules himself could come up with, why are we seemingly further away from peace than ever before? Why is the same cycle of violence, excruciating negotiations, and inevitable disappointment repeated over and over again? Why? And why is there no hope for a peace agreement if this cycle continues? The answer lies in this extremely important book. Among the many facts that you will read about here in this book are the international community tried to resettle, and you know this, resettle and rehabilitate the Palestinian refugees after the 1948 war. This effort was met by resistance and sabotage by Israel's neighbors. So the effort was abandoned. The neighbors wanted to keep the refugee issue alive and to use it as a propaganda weapon against Israel. There is no legal basis or international sanction for a right of return for Palestinians to return to Israel. It does not happen. It never has happened. Most Palestinians, refugees, and I use these quotes, the vast majority live within the border of historic Palestine. So how are they refugees? Where are they refugees from? Where do they want to return? The Oslo Accords ultimately failed, as have all peace efforts, because the Palestinian leadership will not and is afraid to give up the so-called right of return. There is no indication whatsoever that the Palestinians are prepared to give up the claim of a right to return, the right of return. Quite the contrary. It is absurd that the international community supports an organization, as all of us know, UNRWA. I could just say, which one am I talking about? And you would all say UNRWA, that perpetuates and is a huge part of this problem. An organization set up to deal only with Palestinian refugees. All other refugees are under the umbrella of the UNHCR. But UNRWA takes care of the Palestinians. Now, the Trump administration absolutely did the right thing in completely, finally stopping all U.S. funding for UNRWA. But an opportunity was missed because it should have been made explicitly clear that UNRWA itself is a huge problem. And not just because of its many documented abuses and educational abominations. Horrific, the glorification of terrorists. Even more because it perpetuates the myth that Palestinians are refugees waiting for return. Not true. The European Union and the international community need to start telling the Palestinians the truth. They refuse to do so. The truth that they are not going to return to Israel, and that the international community does not support their demand to return. In the wake of the barbaric assault on Israel last month, these issues are more important than ever, because the demand to return is nothing but a code word for the destruction of Israel. And October 7th showed the world what that return would look like. So with that, I could continue to talk more about this magnificent book, but with that, I'm very pleased to introduce Einat, who does not need my stepping stool because she's wonderfully tall. I live in a world of elbows. So the author of The War of Return. If you don't have it, get it. Gil, why aren't you selling it here? What kind of advanced work is he doing for you? So Amazon or independent booksellers. Dr. Einat Wilf is a leading thinker on Israel, on Zionism, on foreign policy and education. She was a member of the Israeli parliament from 2010 to 2013. Born and raised in Israel, Dr. Wilf served as an intelligence officer in the Israeli Defense Forces and later as a foreign policy advisor to Vice Prime Minister Shimon Peres. She's got a BA from Harvard. Not everybody can go to Miami-Dade Community College. Harvard's a safety school. And a PhD from political science from the University of Cambridge. We can't all go to Florida International University and the University of Miami. She was the Goldman Visiting Professor at Georgetown University and is a lecturer at the Reichman University in Israel. She's the author of 7 books, but definitely this is the one you need to pick, the co-author of The War of Return. And as Gil pointed out, the subplot is the most important part. How Western indulgence of the Palestinian dream has obstructed the path to peace. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Einat Wilf, come on over. And I'll bring my stepping stool with me.
Thank you. This was most kind. So I will begin by saying that this moment for a lot of Israelis, for a lot of Jews, and generally for a lot of people around the world, is a moment when we are letting go of delusions. And it's hard. Some of those delusions are deeply held. But if we are truly to emerge from this moment stronger and better, we need to finally let go of those delusions. And I see how some of them are still perpetuated now. But we're never going to get to anywhere better if we will continue to close our eyes. So I want to make the argument that October 7th, 2023 was decades in the making. And I want to address the 2 aspects that were built over decades. The first is the sustaining and stoking of the Palestinian vision that Israel is temporary, that Israel can be undone, that with enough patience and violence, they can ultimately win the war that they have failed to win in 1948. So that's one piece that was decades in the making. And another piece, which we're seeing erupting globally, is the mental preparation that whatever happened on October 7th, the Israelis had it coming. So I want to address those 2 aspects. The first about the Palestinian issue. Just so you understand how powerful the delusions still are, we are hearing still people say Hamas does not represent the Palestinians. Now I know we deeply want to believe it. We want to imagine that some alien race entered Gaza, hijacked its people, and committed atrocities completely unrelated to what came before it. But if we will continue to hold on to this delusion, we are only guaranteeing that whatever happened on October 7th will happen once more, and even worse, if that is possible. Because where did Hamas emerge from? Hamas emerged from an idea that is known here as from the river to the sea, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. Palestine will be free. Of what? Of sovereign and free Jews, of the state of Israel, of the Jewish state. I tweeted a few days ago that the day that from the river to the sea will have the same social standing as Heil Hitler, we will have made a massive step towards peace. Because that will be the moment that people will understand the ideology that has been animating this conflict forever. Now, I grew up in the Israeli peace camp. I cheered every Land for Peace proposal. I deeply believed that the day that the Palestinians will have their own state in the West Bank and Gaza is the day we will have peace. I wanted us to just get out of there so that they can finally pursue their own lives. We projected onto them our imagination, our vision. We thought that just like Zionism, just like the Jewish people, all that the Palestinians wanted was to just build a state, even if only in part of the land, and that as soon as they would be free to do so, there will be peace. And like many Israelis of the peace camp, I followed how again and again, and this is not going too far back, with the Arafat in 2000, with Abu Mazen in 2008, and in later opportunities. Again and again, when faced with clear, concrete opportunities to have their own state in the territory of the West Bank and Gaza, no settlements, ending the military occupation, full independence, capital in East Jerusalem, every time they walked away. And not only did they walk away, what followed was brutal violence. People were surprised by October 7th, by the brutality, but it's not new. People call the violence of the years of 2001, 2, 3, 4, the Second Intifada, a shaking off. It sounds so benign. Those were brutal massacres in cafes, in restaurants, in buses, against people who just went out to have pizza. And this was after the Palestinians could have had everything that we were told they wanted, that the problems were the settlements or the occupation or East Jerusalem. So there it is. They could have had it. And they walk away and they follow it with brutal massacres and violence. So a lot of Israelis began to ask a simple question. What do Palestinians want? I asked that question. And remember how people think that it's really important that we dialogue? So I participated in some of those dialogues. And to their credit, they were very clear. They told me that the Jews are not a people, you're only a religion. You have no connection to the land of Israel, nothing. You don't have the right to self-determination. And I remember those were moderate. I participated in events with moderate Palestinians because I was a member of the Labor Party working with Shimon Peres. And I realized how they think about the issue and how I think is completely different. I thought it's about land, occupation, freedom. They made it very clear to me that the problem is my very existence. And as I started to do the research for this book, I came across a remarkable phrase by British Foreign Minister after World War II, Ernst Bevin. If you know anything about him, he was not a friend to the Jewish people nor to the Zionist movement. But he got it. And he needs to explain to the people of Britain why Britain is throwing the mandate that it received from the League of Nations to help the Jews achieve sovereignty, it's throwing it back to the United Nations. And he says the following, and this is the date, February 1947, there's no state of Israel, there's no refugees, there's no occupation, there's no settlement. All of the things we're told are the problem. They don't exist. And what does he say? He says His Majesty's government has come to the conclusion that the conflict in the land is irreconcilable. He calls it irreconcilable in February 47. He says, look, in the land there are two peoples, Jews and Arabs, so there were no question about what the two groups are. And he says, and each one of these groups has one top priority, the thing they care about more than anything. And he says the following, for the Jews, the top priority is to have a state. The Jews want a state. For the Arabs, the top priority is for the Jews not to have a state in any part of the land. Listen to what this conflict is, because this is the conflict, and nothing else has changed. The Jews want a state. The Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. That's it. That's the conflict, and that's why it's irreconcilable. You can't divide the land. That's not what's going to solve this issue. Which means that the only way that we ever begin to come close to any kind of peace, to any kind of change, is that this idea that the Jews should not have a state in any part of the land, this idea has to go away. Because this is the idea that has sustained generation after generation of trained murderers. Hamas is not some new phenomena. When you have an entire people who are mobilized for the idea that there should not be a Jewish state, which means that they tried to do it in the 20s, in the 30s, in the 40s, and they failed in 1948 because despite their considerable efforts, the state of Israel emerged as independent. They didn't accept this outcome. They immediately got to work to try to undo that through repeated wars and economic boycotts and international condemnations and the refusal of the Arab refugees to ever resettle. Because the Arab refugees, now known as the Palestinians, they understood that the day they will resettle is the day that the war against the Jewish state is over. So generation after generation, they refused resettlement. They hijacked an organization called UNRWA that was established temporarily to help them resettle. But they hijacked it in a long train of hijacking things. They hijacked UNRWA to make it essentially a Palestinian organization, and they were very smart about it. Initially, UNRWA was going to be called REWA, R-E-W-A, but they insisted to have the letters UN so that it will have this cachet of international legitimacy. But it's not. It's a Palestinian organization completely devoted to the idea that Palestinians do not have to come to terms with the existence of the state of Israel. So they've created unique conventions of being refugees generation after generation, of inventing something that doesn't exist for any other refugee group, of a right of return to another sovereign state. All unique conventions for the Palestinians intended to convey one thing, that from their perspective, the war of 1948 is an open case, and that they can still win it. And you know, when the book came out, I invented a word called West-plaining. We see a lot of it now in the media. West-plaining is when Western diplomats and journalists explain away what Palestinians have just said. And to the credit of Palestinians, for a century, they have made their intentions very clear. That's why Ernst Bevin was able to know what they wanted. But Westerners don't want to look it in the eye. So Palestinians will say what their intentions are, and Westerners will explain it away as no, it's about the occupation, it's about territory, it's about the conditions in Gaza, all the things that they never say. And in Gaza, just so we understand, 2/3 of the people who live in Gaza, despite almost all of them being born in Gaza, having lived there all their lives, their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents were born there. They were not displaced by war, but they consider themselves refugees from a war that supposedly ended more than 7 decades ago. So when the West pours billions into Gaza, thinking that the problem is the conditions in Gaza, that they just need more money. But this is an entire society, and there are no dissenters on this. Again, we need to let go of the delusion that there's any dissent on this in Palestinian society. This is a society mobilized for the idea that their duty is to liberate Palestine from the river to the sea. So when money flows into Gaza, when cement flows into Gaza, they don't think, oh, let's make Gaza a beautiful, prosperous example of what it's like when Palestinians control territory. No, they say, great, we now have a launch pad, literally a launch pad, from which to take back, in their mind, Palestine. So any money that will flow there is guaranteed to serve the war machine. And it's not just Hamas. Generation after generation, trained murderers emerge to liberate Palestine. The perpetrators of the massacre of the Israeli athletes in the 1972 Munich Olympics were graduates of UNRWA schools. The current perpetrators and planners were graduates of UNRWA schools. They did what they did because they believed that in doing so, they were liberating Palestine. This is the euphoria that you saw in the first few days. That's what they spoke about. That's what they want. Now, I'm reading now a fascinating book called Embracing Defeat about Japan, because we need to think on that scale. Today, we think of Japan as a lovely country of sushi and Pikachu. I'm sure you know that the atrocities committed in Korea, in China, were on a level and a scale that is unimaginable. On the eve of surrender, Japanese society was described as a society mobilized for death. Even in Nazi Germany, there are a few people who tried to assassinate Hitler towards the end. In Japan, there was no such dissent. And it was understood by the American occupiers that if there were ever to be peace, Japan as a society had to change. It wasn't enough to just disarm the Japanese military, which is why it's not going to be enough, even if we kill all 30, 40, 50,000 trained Hamas murderers tomorrow. If all the tunnels are gone, if all the weapons are gone, there will be another group of trained murderers rising under another name, just as like we had Fatah and Jihad and the DFLP. There will always be a new organization rising to liberate Palestine until we finally understand what we're up against. So I know that this is not easy because most people want to escape the magnitude of the challenge. Much easier to go with the cliche of Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinians and they just want a better future and let's just make sure that the aid flows in. Unless Palestinian society rethinks its very goals, its very values, what it means to be a Palestinian, we can never move forward to peace. That's what we need to address. So that's one aspect that has been decades in the making, and too many have closed their eyes to what was going on. And now I just want to say a few words about what's been decades in the making here and around the world. For years, if not decades, we have been subjected to something that I call the placard strategy. The placard strategy, and you know what it is because you've seen it on placards in anti-Israel demonstrations, is the process by which you write on one side of the equation, Israel, Zionism, sometimes you just draw a Star of David, and then an equation sign. And the placard strategy has been so effective that we know what's on the other side of the equation. Colonialism, racism, apartheid, Nazism, genocide, ethnic cleansing. And just to give you a sense that those words are not chosen for their description of reality, because they're not, they're chosen because they evoke evil. And how can you see that? Because in recent years, it was written that Zionism in Israel equal white supremacy. Where did that come from? It only came from the fact that the mood here was that white supremacy is evil and everyone agreed. So let's take white supremacy and put it next to Israel and Zionism and the Star of David, regardless of any kind of historical sense. Now, the placard strategy has been so powerful and effective that you can put an anti-Israel speaker on TV for 30 seconds, and no matter what the question is, they will manage to say apartheid, genocide, racism in that answer. And what happens in the process is that we are all subjected to an ongoing refrain that says Israel, Zionism, Star of David equal evil. Israel, Zionism, Star of David equal evil. And it's a refrain that keeps, it's in academia and it's on television, it's on placards, it's everywhere. And as I'm sure some of you know, it is the greatest legacy of the Soviet Union in America. The Soviet Union no longer exists, but its greatest legacy is very much alive. Every time that someone says Israel apartheid, Israel genocide, a Soviet angel flaps their wings. Because this is the idea that they developed already in the 1960s and 70s. So it has nothing to do with recent actions by any Israeli government. And the Soviets understood the importance of respectability. They are the people, the heirs of those who wrote the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now, today, anyone can publish a book. But more than a century ago, a book, that meant respectability. And it's not a coincidence that the Protocols is one of the most published books till the present day. Because suddenly, all these libels and conspiracies were given the respectability of a book. But after World War II, the Soviet Union could no longer be open anti-Semites, right? They just defeated the Nazis. You don't get to be more anti-Semitic than defeating the Nazis. And of course, they brought down Tsarist Russia with its anti-Semitism. So the Soviets developed the respectable anti-Zionism with its equation of Zionism and Israel with all that is evil. And the empire doesn't exist anymore, but it's very much alive here. And after decades of having that in the making, what we saw erupt on October 7th is that moment, the preparation of decades, that because Israel and Zionism are evil, then they had it coming. Because that's what you do with evil. right? You don't negotiate with it. You don't divide land with it. You eradicate it. So anything that was done is thereby retroactively justified. And that's why you can see so many people in the streets with no sense that they are holding abhorrent positions. Because for decades, they've been trained to believe in the placard strategy that anything Israel and Zionism equals evil. So when I get to this point, a lot of people are utterly depressed because it's much easier to say, let's kill 30,000 Hamasniks and go home. It's much, much harder to really root out ideas that have been built and indulged and sustained for decades. But as I was reading this book about Japan, what was fascinating was the debate among the American policymakers between the radical branch and the less radical branch. The radical one ultimately won. The radical branch claimed that the non-radical one were only trying to trim a very sick tree. But that if Japan were ever to be a peaceful society, the entire tree of militarism, of a society mobilized for death, had to be uprooted, branch and root. And that's the kind of radical visionary thinking that we need today. Ultimately, this was a vision that brought peace, that created a different world, that created a Germany and Japan that are pillars of a peaceful world, which would have been unimaginable in the 30s and early 40s. So we need that kind of radical vision that, first of all, understands what we're up against, refuses to indulge, refuses to give in to easy cliches, and ultimately is willing to do the hard, long work necessary to create a real transformation in Palestinian society. Thank you. Thank you. Please, yes. Yes. Certainly. I mean, if we continue with the analogy with Nazi Germany or with Imperial Japan, yes, you had the process of winning the war. You had the stage of unconditional surrender. But what was impressive in the American and Allied thinking about those societies is that it didn't end there, is that they understood that after the surrender, after the Allies are victorious, you don't just, call it a day. You actually invest in recreating, rebuilding that society, because you need to make sure that they will not do again. For Germany, it was basically 75 years of Germany being a problem for Europe. Japan had its own, depending how you count it. But it was the understanding that destruction and defeat are not where it ends. What you need to have later is the radical vision of transformation. And this is what I want to press, because right now we're in the process of destruction. But what I am not happy with, at least the way that our government is phrasing the goals, is that they keep on talking about destroying Hamas. And I understand the desire to have a limited, achievable goal. But what I despair in is that this is a goal that, again, shows a lack of understanding of where Hamas emerged from. When the UN Secretary General said, October 7th didn't happen in a vacuum, my response was, hell yeah, it didn't happen in a vacuum, but it's the wrong vacuum that you think about. And let's discuss the vacuum. And this is exactly what I talked about, how this was decades in the making. So we have reached this point that the West actually has been complicit for decades in sustaining, indulging, fueling this Palestinian vision, never wanting to confront it. And if we continue on this path, there will neither be victory nor the remaking of Palestinian society. So we need to understand that it's an entire society mobilized for the idea of liberating Palestine. In many ways, this is what it means to be a Palestinian. It's to believe that your goal in life is to liberate Palestine. And this is true for the intellectual living in London, for the supposedly moderate Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, and for the people of Gaza and Hamas. Now, what does it mean to destroy? Even in Nazi Germany and Japan, ultimately the destruction was limited. So many people were killed, but at the end of the day, the vast majority of Germans and Japanese emerged from the war as people who were alive. And those were the people that had to be, call it, reprogrammed. They had to become a different people. The problem was not with the fact that they were Homo sapiens, that they existed as human beings. The problem was their ideology and their level of commitment to that ideology. And when you think about victory, when you think about the Japanese embracing defeat, when you think in those terms, what I wanted to highlight is that it's not a single moment of destruction. It's not the moment of surrender. It's not the moment when the war is won. It's actually the aftermath of ensuring that those societies have different values and different ideas. Please. So as I said, to the credit of Palestinians, they've been very clear for a century as to what they're fighting for. And I agree with you completely. One of the reasons I'm very proud of this book is that this book gives the Palestinians the respect of taking them at their word. A few months ago, the book won this prize in Israel, and there was the ceremony, and at DNI, and my co-writer, we talked about the main thesis of the book. Now, in the audience were two Druze officers. If you know, in Israeli society, Druze are a small Arabic-speaking Muslim sect that are loyal to whichever country they live in. They serve in the Israeli military. So these two senior Druze officers come up to a DNI at the end of the talk and they say, "Congratulations. We find the two Israeli Jews who know what the conflict is about. The Arabs keep telling you what it's about, and you're just not putting it into your head." So I'm actually going to make it a little harder than what you said. On this issue, there are no dissenting voices. Now, I give this talk, and I've given it over the years to many groups, and especially students, and I understand that they rebel, but almost every group. They're like, "You're painting such a broad, this is such a broad brush, and it can't be. And it can't be that all Palestinians support that. And just like there are different voices in Israeli society, and there are more extremist people and less, there must be different voices among Palestinians." So my answer has always been the same. That actually by making such a broad claim, I have opened myself up to easy rebuttal. It's easy to refute me. So go ahead. Please bring me a Palestinian who, in their own words, because of West Plaining, I refuse to have anyone who tells me, "Oh, they told me that." They have to say it in their own words publicly. It could be an op-ed, it could be a tweet, it could be a speech, but it has to be in their own words and it has to be public. And the words can't be some mushy, "Oh, we long for the day of peace," or "We hope a ceasefire and for the violence to end." You know, when I worked with Shimon Peres and all that, there was this idea that in peacemaking, we need constructive ambiguity. Let's just fudge the issues, get everyone to sign an agreement. They'll build trust, things will take care. What we know is that it's been destructive ambiguity. So I've become a proponent of what I call constructive specificity. Be very, very precise. So what do we need to hear? I, a Palestinian, support the equal right of the Jewish people, as a nation, to self-determination in their historical homeland, in the land of Israel. We understand that the implication of that is that we can build the state of Palestine next to the Jewish state of Israel rather than instead of it. We understand that this means that we are now refugees and that we do not have a right of return into the sovereign state of Israel. That's what we need to hear. I can assure you no one comes back. And I can even tell you a little story that a few months ago, I met with someone super, super senior in Congress. He read the book, he loved it. And he said, "Einat, but there must be other Palestinians that think differently. Maybe the younger generation." And I was like, in many ways, it's even worse. And he had two staffers sitting with him. And the staffers were like, "Oh, thank God. He keeps sending us to find these Palestinian voices and we never find them. So now we know that it's not that we're not doing our job." So look, beginning in the last few days, there's one person on Twitter who's been very vocal. I keep retweeting him. I'm actually looking for these voices. If anyone finds me them, I highlight them, I platform them, because I believe that the moment that we will begin to have a critical mass of such voices, that's the moment when Palestinian society is transformed. We can begin to imagine and think of peace. But right now, this is about it. 1-2 people on Twitter that are sidelined from Palestinian society. So I actually stand behind this very broad claim. You know, people sometimes tell me, "Oh, there's opposition to Hamas in Gaza. They're not popular." I'm like, that's true. There's substantial opposition on issues of corruption, on issues of economy, on issues of religion, but they all agree on the slaughter of Jews. That's not an issue of contention there. So again, we need to not tell ourselves stories and project onto them what would make our life easier. I posted a few days ago this distinction between doing good and feeling good. And my experience is that too many policymakers just want to feel good. And what does it mean to feel good? Call for a ceasefire, make sure there's aid going into Gaza. That makes you feel good. It does no good. Doing good means doing a lot of things that don't feel good. Like was said here, it means telling Palestinians that it's over, that the war of 1948 is a closed case, that the state of Israel is here to stay, that they are not refugees, that they do not possess a right of return, that they need to move on. I don't know many policymakers who are willing to do those things. I assure you, I'm having no fun. I want to be like the nice person who wants peace and butterflies and unicorns. I don't enjoy the last few years where I say all these dark things. It's not fun. But it is the truth. And I call myself these days a long-term peace activist because we have a history of the transformation of societies. We have examples of having peace where people thought that it could never be done. But it was not done by people who ignored what they were up against. Please.
I'm sorry. First off, thank you for being here. This is as phenomenal as your book,
Thank you.
where I learned so much. So I've done a lot of work in the Arab world beyond the Middle East, and I don't detect the same intransigence. Maybe I'm not listening carefully. And then came the Abraham Accords, and several Arab countries recognize the state of Israel. And further away, they bless each mile. In Algeria, they 1,000 miles. That's Allah bless every mile. They want to be near it. How they believe, I don't know. Can you speak to whether there are coalitions possible
Yes.
any longer?
I will even say something more in that direction. If I see any glimmer of hope, it's in the Arab world. In the West, I find that it's very hard to bring this message. The Soviet capture has been almost complete. Adi and I went many years ago to the heart of darkness, to Brussels, to the EU, where they fund UNRWA. And we met there with the person who's responsible for funding UNRWA, and the EU plus European countries are the top funders of UNRWA, about 2/3, if not more. And Adi and I give the entire talk and background. And this man at one point looks at us as if he had a completely new thought. And he says it in the pace that I'm going to say it now. He says, "So you want to tell me that the reason we don't have peace is because they still want all of it?" And Adi and I are like, yes. But the next day, he continues giving money to UNRWA. So I have less hope on the West waking up from that, even though I continue to invest in it. And increasingly, my glimmer of hope comes from the Arab world. Why? Because to the credit of the Arab world, they actually know what the conflict is about. They were never fooled for a single minute that it was ever about settlement or occupation or East Jerusalem or the living conditions in Gaza. They always knew what they were supporting. They always knew that they were the blank check and the blank diplomatic check for the Palestinian intransigence of saying no to Israel. It's important to understand that without this check, we don't have a conflict. If the Israeli-Palestinian conflict had ever only been the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Jews and Arabs between the river and the sea duking it out, That conflict was over in April 1948. In April 1948, pretty much the situation is settled. It then becomes the Arab-Israeli conflict when several Arab armies invade, and it is sustained this way for decades. It is the Arab power and the Muslim power that sustains the ability of Palestinians to keep saying no, no, and no. We'll keep fighting until there's no Jewish state. Because when people, again, various diplomats and journalists in Europe and the West would tell me, the Palestinians know they're not, that Israel's here to stay. They know they're not returning. And I would always tell them, look, if anyone is delusional or irrational in this conflict, it's us Jews, not them. I mean, they're looking, open a map. They're looking at the map. They see 7 million Jews struggling to survive amid almost 500 million Arabs, 1.3 billion Muslims. They rationally conclude, they're like, this is not going to last much longer. Another generation, another 5 generations, but that's it. This will be like the Crusader state. This is why they love to call Israel the second Crusader state, because it was a temporary foreign implant that they ultimately threw away. This is why Hamas now feels like Salah ad-Din, right? They're throwing out the Crusader state. So this has sustained, together with the Soviet Union and Western indulgence, this has sustained the Palestinian ability to say no. If Arab support begins to wane, if this blank check that has been written for decades begins to peel away, then we begin to have hope. And it's not a coincidence that the more successful Arab countries are, the more they are letting go of anti-Zionism as a defining obsession of their society. In general, anti-Zionism is the ideology of failure. From the Soviet Union to the Arab world to Jeremy Corbyn's Labor Party to American campuses. As it was said here, I studied at Harvard. That brand is quickly losing its cachet at this rate. I mean, anti-Zionism leads societies to collapse onto themselves. There's no society that somehow was obsessed with anti-Zionism that was ever good to its Jews. It always turns hostile to its Jews, and that ultimately emerged as a prosperous, successful society. So it's not a coincidence that when you're beginning to have Arab countries that are looking to the future, and they want to build better societies, and they want to emerge from decades of failed Arab kind of life, they're letting go of anti-Zionism. So this is where I find hope, because only the Arab world is really in the position to begin to end this. Now, I'm under no illusion. Those voices in the Arab world are still the minority, and they're hanging by a thread. But it's the only place where I can see hope emerging. And some of it has to do with the understanding of destruction and failure. Remember after 9/11, the whole discourse after 9/11 was about the failure of the Arab world, that it's just a landscape of failure. And after the Arab Spring, this even became stronger, that this is a region from which only terrorism and oil get exported. But in parallel, Arab leaders, especially in the Gulf, realized that if they're going to let those extremist ideologies fester, it will be their undoing. And they understood that they need to begin to have another vision of what Islam is, that it could be a moderate force, of what being Arab is, and that they need to have this vision for young Arabs across the Arab world. And this vision is part and parcel with normalizing relations with Israel. I sometimes call the Abraham Accords collateral benefit. We're not the central story here. The central story is the remaking of what it means to be Arab, to be a proud Arab, to be a proud Muslim. And part of it is to recognize that the Jews are not crusaders, they're Abraham. They have a historical claim that is part of the region. So again, this is the minority. I'm under no illusion, but it's the only place that I find real hope these days. Please.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here, and I appreciate your work. And I agree with you. And I'm wondering if you can comment on two things in the vein you were just speaking about. Have you seen, I think it was on Twitter and different social medias, the son of a Hamas leader?
Yes.
And then in tandem to that, are you able to comment on Iran and some of the feed I have seen of the younger generation Iran really supporting Israel morally, with morale, if there's any insights on
Yes.
the Iran side of it?
Yes. So I'll start with Iran. As you can see, I'm really, really trying not to fall into wishful thinking. It's like we see a video of students refusing to step on the flag of Israel or booing, some Palestinian-Iranian march, and we're thinking, yay. Someone tweeted, I thought it was very smart. He said, basically, the current race is what will unravel first, 1948 or 1979. So essentially, the state of Israel or the Iranian Revolution. I certainly hope it's going to be the Iranian Revolution. But the idea so I'm trying not to fall into wishful thinking. There's no question that if those are real changes, that's also a major source of hope for the future. I'm sure some of you remember the day before the Soviet Union collapsed, this was impossible, and the day after they collapsed, it was inevitable. This might happen with Iran. We know that often corrupted, desiccated regimes survive another generation, even though there's nothing there. So who knows, might happen tomorrow, might happen in a generation, but there's some glimmer of hope there, but I'm trying not to fall into wishful thinking. But we know that we have a generation that is already pretty much seen what the Islamic Revolution is, and they're less than excited about it. How far is it? How powerful? We can't know. But this also has to do with the fact that Hamas, despite belonging to the Muslim Brotherhood Sunni branch, is supported by Iran, which is Shiite, because the Palestinian cause, as I've discussed, has always been the way for Arab powers, Muslim powers, to burnish their credentials. That's why Turkey uses it when it wants to burnish its neo-Ottoman credentials as the true representative of the Muslim Ummah, and that's why Iran is doing it to kind of have everyone conveniently forget that they belong to what is generally a detested sect of Islam, so this way they can be the protectors and the defenders of true Islam, and that's where their interests lie. And what you spoke about the son of one of the senior members of Hamas, when I was a member of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, we were actually instrumental in making sure that he become a citizen there, because we wrote the letter that confirmed that he had been courageous and helpful to save Israelis from Hamas terrorism. It's always the people from the inside. Like I said, the Arab world never had any illusions about what the conflict was about. And he has no illusions about what Hamas wants. And he says it. And he's very clear about it. And again, Hamas are also very clear about it. It's just that no one wants to listen. People want to, one of the biggest things that happens in this conflict is the complete reversal of cause and effect. Rather than understanding that the total refusal to allow Jews to be free and sovereign in any part of the land is the root cause, everything the Jews in Israel do in response to the threat becomes the retroactive cause of why that happened. So now the war in Gaza is somehow the retroactive cause of what happened on October 7th. And you're seeing it all the time. And there's a complete refusal to really take Palestinians at their word and to understand what they're fighting for, and to understand that as long as they believe that, they will mobilize all resources given to them to that end, and they will never build anything. Palestinian society, and this is a tragedy, has been a society mobilized for destruction for a century. It has never been a society that has a vision of building, of creating, that said, let's have world-class universities. Let's make sure that we make a major scientific contribution. No. I mean, what happened in Gaza, that required planning, that required ingenuity, that required mobilization. Think about all the energy, all the brains that went to this singular cause of destruction. What if all that was channeled to build something? But it will only be channeled to build something once they no longer hold the destruction of the Jewish state as their most noble commitment. Once that happens, all the energies of the Palestinian people will be unleashed for construction. But it's only if they rethink what their goals are and who they are and what they want to achieve in this world. Please.
Thank you. You were speaking about education and UNRWA. I'm wondering if you could address what's the focal point we have to look at. Is it the Palestinian Ministry of Education or UNRWA who does the curriculum? Is it the staff who is going to teach whatever they want to teach, no matter what the curriculum says? So what's the most effective way of addressing that issue so the next generation is not as like this one?
Okay. So you kind of answered it in your question. The problem is not the textbooks. As you know it from a lot of the debates here, parents are generally going to oppose educating their children against their most sacredly held values. Education happens after the values change, not before. So like you said, let's say tomorrow, and this has been an issue, we discuss it in the book since the 60s. You had Teddy Kennedy looking at the UNRWA books in the 60s and being appalled in the 60s. And nothing has been fixed because the problem was never the books. You could give UNRWA schools tomorrow the most pro-Israel, Zionist, Jew-loving books. The teachers, who are all Palestinian, people think that UNRWA is, when you hear UNRWA staff were killed, you imagine some nice Swedish and Norwegian volunteers who came to help. No, it's a Palestinian organization. These are Palestinians, some of them fighters. Those teachers, all Palestinians, all believing in the noble cause of from the river to the sea, will enter the room and will say, dear students, please close the books, put them aside, and let me tell you about the Palestine that was stolen from us and why it is your duty to take it back. That's what's going to happen. So what needs to happen is nothing less than dismantling UNRWA. There should be no money, no institution, nothing that goes to that. Because there's nothing, this goes to the Japanese idea. You cannot just trim the branches. This is the organization that has a major contribution, not just to the creation of a distinct Palestinian identity, let's say a separate form, Syrian or Lebanese or Egyptian or Jordanian, but to constructing that identity around the idea of revenge and return. So this is the organization that is pretty much created and sustained this toxic identity. So you're not going to get anywhere with just changing the books. And it's always driven me, the books are a good way to understand what's going on, but changing the books is not how you're going to change things. You change things by withdrawing the fuel, the money that goes into UNRWA, the legitimacy. I mean, Palestinians describe it. And as I said, they were smart in the 50s to insist that it would be called UN. They say every day that we go to the school and we hear that Palestine was stolen from us and that we need to liberate it, and we see the blue UN, we know that the world is with us. That's what needs to go. They need to understand that the world is not with them when this is being taught. That the world will be with them if they develop a constructive vision, but that the world refuses to continue to fuel their destructive vision. So there is nothing good that can come from continuing to sustain UNRWA for a single day. And it's not the books. It has to go root and branch. And I'll just say in this context, when the UAE signed the Abraham Accords, within 2 weeks, they changed the books. First, they signed the accords, then they changed the books because they realized we want to ensure that this act that we took will be in the hearts of people for generations. You cannot do it now if you don't dismantle the entire structure that sustains the complete opposite ideology.
Thank you, Einat. I'd like to ask a question. So based on what you're saying, if this, or once this operation against Hamas concludes, do you think that a collective statement by European presidents and allies to the Palestinian people, something to the effect of, we are with you, but we will not tolerate your current design on eliminating Israel. We will not have sympathy for you if you continue with this ideology. If you truly want to have a state, if you truly want to live in peace, then you've got to change your ideology and create a new society. Otherwise, we will not be for you and the world will not defend you.
I would say hear, hear, and amen. Yes, that's exactly the message that needs to be conveyed in every possible forum, in every possible context. You know, I already see it. Let's say the operation concludes with a certain sense of, okay, we've killed 20,000 Hamas-trained murderers and the tunnels are disabled and all that. If we immediately rush, as so many have rushed, and I have a mountain of essays saying, don't start rebuilding Gaza before you deal with the ideology of Gaza. Because all the money, I have essays from 2017, 18, 19, 20, saying all the money you're putting into Gaza is going to go underground, is going to go to the war machine, because they believe that this is a noble cause. You know, often, again, I have a lot of well-meaning people, delegations coming to Israel, and they're saying, but don't the people of Gaza want a better future? A future for their children? And when Westerners think of a better future, they think, don't they want their kids to just study and go to college and have a nice house and have a good job? And I always have to tell them, that's the better future that they want. The future of Palestine is free from the river to the sea. That's the future they believe in. And we can't bribe them away from believing that. They have to be forced to understand that they are alone in this ideology, that the world does not support the idea that the Jews should not have a state, that Israel is a temporary aberration. That's the message. And if they begin to hear it from their Arab colleagues and they begin to hear it from the West, and that they realize that they have nowhere to turn, then you can begin to see the voices emerging in Palestinian society that say, maybe enough is enough. But right now, we're not helping those voices to emerge. We're actually quashing them by continuing to fuel this, Palestinians don't really mean from the river to the sea. It's actually a benign idea of rights and equality. We can't fall for that anymore. And we need to be very clear about it. And only then can change begin to happen. Which is why also all the discourse, people often ask, after Abu Mazen, maybe there's a different leadership and all that. And I'm like, stop. The leaders are always ever going to reflect the parameters set by their people. And the Palestinians will never have a leader that challenges the from the river to the sea ideology unless they themselves begin to change. And then those leaders will emerge. And they will only change when they find that there is no more fuel for that ideology. And this is the tragedy, because they have been fueled in it for decades and decades. Adi and I would often come very frustrated out of meetings with European diplomats, realizing that we have to undo a mountain of lies and delusions that has been built for decades. And we need to begin to really undo it brick by brick. But what you described is exactly what needs to happen.
Much of the fuel for today's support of Hamas is coming from young people the world over, and including on our campuses. These people have been indoctrinated with woe the poor Gazans. How do you get your message of a brighter future to the younger generation within America, of those people who have become advocates of Hamas, of poor Gazans, and doing exactly the wrong thing, exactly contrary to what you're suggesting?
So my only answer to that is to understand what's at stake and what is going on, to understand the placard strategy. The biggest mistake so many of us have made is to think that during the years, those were good faith discussions. We actually thought that those were good faith discussions about Israeli policies and whether Israel is being okay or not, and whether, and we would really begin to engage, Israel's not apartheid, look, and Arabs and have equal rights and citizens, and we didn't realize that those were not good faith discussions. Those were processes of creating a global mindset whereby Israel, whatever is going to happen to Israel, it will have had it coming. And that the eradication of Israel and Zionism is the one thing that will bring good to the world. When you're seeing those placards with "Keep the World Clean," if you've seen some of them, showing a Star of David in the trash bin with the headline "Keep the World Clean," the notion that the collective Jews is what stands between this world and utopia is a very old idea. So we need to understand that this is what's going on. We need to expose it. We need to battle it. We can't engage with it as a good faith discussion. Young people need to understand what they are parroting. When I begin to expose how the Soviet Union began to export all these ideas in the 60s and 70s, before there was Netanyahu and before there was this government, before there were settlements, before there was occupation. So many people pride themselves on saying Israel is apartheid or that, as if they just had a new insight, a new idea. They just studied the topic. No, they're parroting an imported ideology that has never brought anything good to any society that adopted it. I always tell them, look, I participated in 2 high-profile debates several years ago on whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and I lost them all because the other side will always bring this Satmar Jew, and they'll be like, look, there's a Jew who opposes Israel or Zionism, so we're not against Jews. You know, when I taught Zionism and anti-Zionism in Georgetown, I had a few Muslim students. And when we studied the theology of the Satmar and the Torah Karta, they said, you know, we were always brought up to believe that those were our allies and they were supporting the Palestinian cause and they cared about Palestinians being kind of underdogs. But now we realize that they basically don't want Zionism now, they want Zionism later. So, I mean, people just play this game. So at one point I said, you know what? I'm not splitting hairs about whether you're going to find me 5 Jews who oppose Zionism. I'm just going to look in practice, not in theory. In practice, what happens to every society that has made anti-Zionism a main ideology? And I go, Exhibit A, the Arab world. Exhibit B, the Soviet Union. Exhibit C, Jeremy Corbyn's Labor Party. Exhibit D, American campuses. And I show them the arc. And I show them how when anti-Zionists say, oh, it's not about Jews, we love Jews, that's what the Soviet Union did, that's what the Arab world did. And yet within years of anti-Zionism being the defining feature of a society, there are no Jews left. And the society collapses onto itself. There's no arc by which this turns out well. None. And that's what we need to talk about. That this is the arc that they are on. And we need to have no discussion about Israel. This is the mistake we've made. We thought that those were genuine discussions about Israel. They're not. They were the importation of an ideology that destroys a society, and if it's left unarrested, does not allow Jews to live in that society. It's always the same arc. That's the story. And once you begin to see the arc, once you see that there's no way that this ends well, that it's not about helping the underdogs or bringing world peace or equality, that it is the modern incarnation of some very ancient ideas, then perhaps we can begin to get people to see what's going on. I'm not saying it's for sure, but at least let's talk about what's really going on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Einat, for that, as usual, fascinating, troubling, but important presentation. These are, as you said, it's important not to have illusions, and these are the hard truths that we need to hear and that need to be spread widely if we're going to be able to move forward in a constructive way. Thank you all for being here. Before we close, I'd like to ask Jordana McMillan from the Israel Allies Caucus to have the last word and wrap things up.
Thank you, Gil. We're honored to co-sponsor this event today. I feel it was very, very timely given what's going on. We work with the bipartisan Israel Allies Caucus in the House of Representatives. We began a number of years ago during another very trying time in Israel's history during the Second Intifada. As you know, buses were blowing up, as Einat spoke about, and they never knew where the next terror attack was going to happen, and so people stopped going to Israel. And at the time, tourism was still a very, very important industry within Israel. It still is today, but it was a major hit to Israel's economy. And the world seemed to be turning against Israel, even as Israel was constantly dealing with terror attacks. But there was a group of people who kept going to Israel at that time, and that was evangelical Christians. And it wasn't just a trip to the land of the Bible, it was a solidarity mission to tell Israel, you are not alone. And the government of Israel was so moved by this outpouring of support that they established what's called to this day the Knesset Christian Allies Caucus. And their goal was to reach out to Christian leaders and Christian legislators all over the world to encourage that support for Israel. And because of that outreach, the Congressional Israel Allies Caucus was formed here in the House, the first bipartisan pro-Israel caucus. And due to the work of the caucus here in the House, we now have 53 pro-Israel caucuses in nations all over the world. And what we found was that if nations supported Israel or politicians supported Israel because of economic reasons or votes or social reasons, when those reasons went away, so did their support. But if they supported Israel from a basis of faith and deeply held values, that support was never going away. And so what we have are men and women from across the political spectrum who all believe that Israel has the right to exist within safe and secure borders, with Jerusalem as its undivided capital. And I think we can learn an important lesson here today from Jerusalem and the movement of the embassy. The members of our caucus really kept this issue on the political front line. Ileana Ross-Layton was one of those members. And what we saw was when the embassy was finally moved, when the actual facts on the ground were recognized, it brought our policy as the United States into line with reality. And I believe that moving our embassy opened the door for the Abraham Accords. Because we stood up and we said, no, Israel will not divide Jerusalem. Jerusalem only has been and ever will be the capital, the united capital of the Jewish people. And you can negotiate with us based on that reality. And I believe that's what needs to happen today in terms of Israel's borders, in terms of Israel being safe and secure. It's time for policy to reflect the facts on the ground again. As Einat said, to believe Hamas when they say, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. I just want to give a brief story. We had a bipartisan delegation within Israel, Democrat and Republican, and we met with a Muslim sheikh. He had formerly been in prison in his past. He had done some not so great things, and he had ended up in an Israeli prison, but he had reformed. And he had decided that he was going to work in the interfaith realm. He was a member working in an interfaith organization to bring peace. So we went and we met with him and we spoke about the two-state solution, and he spoke about the need for a two-state solution. And it was all going just a little too well, and he was saying all the right things. And so I asked him a qualifying question. I said, so you believe in two states, a Jewish state and a Palestinian state? And he said, no. There will be Palestinians in the Jewish state. He said, but all of Israel is occupied territory. Jerusalem is occupied territory. Tel Aviv is occupied Palestinian territory. And this was a man who was working in interfaith work to bring about peace. And I think this is what Israel's up against. This is what Einat so eloquently spoke about. And I just want to say that I believe that Israel and a strong, secure Israel is the best hope for peace in the region. I believe that the Palestinians have hit the jackpot of where they live in the region. They live next to the most thriving, prosperous, flourishing, innovative state. And the burden is on the Palestinians to take advantage of that opportunity and embrace reality and live alongside Israel in peace. And the burden's on us in the West to stop perpetuating the fantasy of return, i.e. the end of the state of Israel. So thank you to Einat and to the Congresswoman for your moral clarity and for your words here today. We were proud to have co-sponsored it, and thank you most of all to AJIRI and to B'nai B'rith for holding this timely briefing.